Everything about the Kensington Runestone contradicts itself. Scientists can show you evidence it's medieval. Other scientists can show you evidence it's a 19th century fake. Experts argue passionately on both sides. And yet, somewhere beneath centuries of debate lies a simple truth. Either a group of Vikings journeyed deep into Minnesota in the 1300s, or someone perfectly replicated medieval craftsmanship without leaving a single trace of how they did it. This is the story of a stone that refuses to give up its secrets, a mystery that has captivated historians, archaeologists, geologists, and linguists for more than 120 years. The beginning of this enduring mystery takes us to November 8th, 1898. The setting is Douglas County in Minnesota, near the small town of Kensington, in the rolling agricultural landscape of west-central Minnesota, where Scandinavian immigrants had settled in significant numbers. A Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Öhman was doing what farmers in that era routinely did. He was clearing land, removing obstacles that had accumulated over years, preparing his property for better agricultural use and increased productivity. His son worked alongside him in this laborious task. They approached a grove of aspen trees on the farm and began the physically exhausting process of extracting them from the earth. This meant digging around the massive root systems, loosening the soil and pulling with all their strength to tear each tree from the ground. One particular tree resisted their efforts far more stubbornly than the others. Its roots were deep and incredibly stubborn, wrapped around something surprisingly heavy and solid. As they pulled and dug and worked at the problem, something unexpected began to emerge from the soil. It was a stone slab, roughly rectangular in shape, weighing approximately 200 pounds, composed of dark gray sandstone. But this was no ordinary rock left behind by glaciers or erosion. This stone bore deliberate markings. Carved into its face were distinct markings, symbols, and characters that nobody in that entire region had ever encountered before. The Öhmans immediately recognized them as Scandinavian runes, the ancient alphabet of the Norse people from medieval times. Word spread through the local Swedish community with remarkable speed. Within days, linguists and scholars from across the region were examining the stone, working carefully to decipher the runic text carved into its surface. What they discovered was nothing short of extraordinary and historically significant. The inscription told a story that, if authentic, would fundamentally rewrite American history and force a complete reassessment of European exploration timelines. The full translation of the runic inscription reads, 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians, on an exploration journey from Vinland over the west. We had a camp by 2 skerries 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out and fished one day. When we came home, we found 10 of our men red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ship's 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. This inscription, if genuine, provides extraordinarily specific details about an expedition, a violent encounter with indigenous people, and a precise date. If authentic, this stone would be evidence that Nordic explorers reached the interior of North America in the early 1300s, approximately 130 years before Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. This would not only confirm that Vikings reached America, which scholars already believe based on the Lance aux Meadows site, but would suggest they traveled far deeper inland than anyone ever previously suspected. It would mean they navigated inland waterways, possibly the St. Lawrence River system, the Great Lakes, and eventually reached Minnesota through sustained exploration and navigation. It would fundamentally rewrite the entire narrative of European discovery and settlement of North America. Linguists would scrutinize every detail of the text. Historians would examine whether such a journey was even remotely possible. Archaeologists would search desperately for any corroborating evidence supporting the stone's claims. Conservation experts would study its weathering patterns. And yet, after more than 100 years of intense scientific scrutiny, we still do not have a definitive answer. The stone's authenticity remains one of history's most stubborn and unresolved questions. Let us start by examining what makes many intelligent people believe the stone is genuinely authentic and medieval in origin. The most compelling argument supporting authenticity centers on the weathering patterns visible on the runes themselves. When Olof Öhman first uncovered the stone, it was tangled in the roots of an aspen tree that had grown around it over decades. That aspen tree was likely many decades old, possibly older still. The tree's massive roots had grown around and over the stone, pressing against its surface with considerable force. If the stone had been sitting beneath the ground since 1362, subjected to Minnesota's harsh climate with its extreme temperature fluctuations, freeze-thaw cycles, and moisture variations, significant weathering patterns would have accumulated on its surface. The carved runes, being recessed into the stone's surface, would accumulate distinctive weathering patterns consistent with centuries of exposure to these natural forces. In recent years, scientists led by Dr. Richard Nielsen, a materials scientist with a doctorate, and geologist Scott Wolter conducted extensive petrographic analysis of the stone. They examined the incisions under high magnification using modern microscopy and advanced imaging techniques. What they found was what they believed was compelling evidence of significant weathering within the carved channels of the runes. The edges of each individual rune showed deterioration patterns, suggesting they had been exposed to atmospheric conditions for centuries, not mere decades as you would expect from an 1898 carving. When they compared their findings to experimental stones that researchers deliberately weathered in laboratory conditions over shorter periods, the results differed markedly. The Kensington stone showed substantially more extensive weathering than deliberate 19th century carvings should have accumulated in just a few decades of natural exposure. History, archaeology, or historical documentation. Most significantly, he never sought profit from his discovery. He did not attempt to sell the stone for money. He did not actively court publicity or try to become famous from the discovery. He allowed researchers to study it, but he maintained a modest and humble profile throughout his life. How could such an uneducated farmer have fabricated not just a stone carving, but an entire historically accurate inscription in proper Scandinavian runic text with linguistically correct patterns? That would have required knowledge and skills he simply did not demonstrably possess. Furthermore, there is no confession. No one has ever admitted to creating the stone as an elaborate hoax. Despite over a century of investigation and countless accusations and theories about who might have carved it, nobody ever stepped forward to claim responsibility or admit to the deception. This absence of a confession is particularly notable in the history of alleged hoaxes. Most frauds eventually unravel completely because someone involved talks, confesses, or reveals details that expose the deception. But with the Kensington Runestone, an almost supernatural silence persists across generations. The timing matters significantly to believers in authenticity. The inscription specifically mentions Vinland, a name for Norse settlements in North America that appeared in medieval Icelandic sagas. The fact that a farmer in Minnesota in 1898 would know about Vinland specifically requires that he had access to specialized historical documents about Norse exploration. While such information certainly existed in academic circles by the 1800s, it was not common knowledge among ordinary Scandinavian immigrants in rural Minnesota. Yet Öhman somehow incorporated this accurate detail into his stone carving. How would an uneducated farmer know this obscure historical reference? There is additional context supporting the possibility of medieval Norse exploration inland. We now know definitively from verified archaeological evidence that Vikings did indeed reach North America around 1000 AD. The settlement at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered by archaeologists in the 1960s, is dated to approximately 1000 AD. Physical, artifacts, and radiocarbon dating confirm this conclusively beyond any reasonable doubt. If Vikings were in North America 1,000 years before Columbus, sailing the Atlantic and establishing settlements, then the theoretical jump to the idea that some ambitious medieval expedition might have ventured deeper inland in the 1300s seems considerably less outlandish. Travel by water was difficult and dangerous, but not impossible for experienced Norse navigators with advanced maritime technology. Recent research published in 2024 and 2025 has revealed that Vikings engaged in far more extensive trade networks than previously understood by historians. Studies of ancient walrus ivory trade routes show that Norse merchants traveled deep into the high Arctic and actively engaged in sophisticated commerce with indigenous Arctic peoples. DNA evidence has traced walrus skull fragments from remote areas of Greenland across the ocean to European markets, demonstrating a sophisticated intercontinental trading network spanning literally thousands of kilometers. If Vikings were trading this far inland in the Arctic regions, operating complex supply chains and commercial networks, could they not have reached inland North America through similar exploratory and commercial expeditions? The very physical existence of the stone itself presents a genuine enigma to skeptics who question its authenticity. How would an uneducated 19th century farmer have acquired the specialized geological knowledge and advanced stoneworking ability necessary to perfectly replicate medieval carving techniques on a stone that genuinely appears ancient? The composition of the stone, the precise depth and quality of the cuts, the patina and weathering patterns all suggest genuine age. Successfully replicating all of these characteristics would have required extraordinary skill, training, and access to materials and technical knowledge that Öhman simply did not demonstrably possess or have access to. But here's precisely where the contradiction truly reveals itself in all its complexity. For every argument supporting authenticity and medieval origin, there exists an equally compelling argument against it, suggesting 19th century fabrication. Let us begin with geological analysis. The stone itself is made of sandstone, specifically a type known to geologists as greywacke. Detailed geological analysis of the stone's precise composition and internal structure reveals that this particular type of sandstone is not native to the Kensington area of Minnesota. Geologists have determined through comparative analysis that the stone would have necessarily originated elsewhere, possibly from geological deposits located some considerable distance away from the discovery site. If the stone was truly left there by Vikings in 1362, how did they transport such a heavy 200-pound object from a distant quarry across the Atlantic Ocean? What medieval Norse expedition would have deliberately carried a 200-pound commemorative stone across dangerous ocean waters, up the St. Lawrence River, through the Great Lakes system, and into Minnesota? This logistics scenario seems wildly impractical and unlikely. The more logical explanation is that someone in the 19th century obtained the stone from somewhere else entirely and carved it locally in Minnesota. Moreover, detailed analysis of the stone's weathering patterns, while compelling to some experts, is actually inconsistent with what you would expect from centuries of exposure. Certain aspects of the carving show far less erosion than you would realistically expect from over 500 years of Minnesota's harsh weather cycles. The calcite coating present on portions of the stone resembles artificial stucco or plaster more closely than it resembles natural geological weathering patterns. If the stone had truly been buried since 1362, deep underground where Öhman found it, how did atmospheric weathering accumulate on its carved surface? Stones buried in soil are protected from atmospheric conditions. The runes would remain relatively pristine if they had been sheltered underground all those centuries. The weathering patterns suggest exposure to surface conditions over shorter timeframes. The tool marks present on the stone show characteristics consistent with 19th century metalworking tools and stoneworking techniques rather than medieval Norse craftsmanship methods. When experts examined the precise impressions left by whatever implement carved the runes, they found patterns matching metalworking and stoneworking techniques common in Sweden and Scandinavia during the 1800s. Medieval Norse tools and techniques, based on what we know from archaeological evidence at verified Viking sites like Lance aux Meadows, produced distinctly different characteristics and mark patterns. The specific carving style and technique suggest 19th century origins rather than medieval. The linguistic evidence is equally problematic for authenticity claims. The runes themselves, while technically correct as Scandinavian characters, employ a stylistic approach that is distinctly 19th century Swedish rather than medieval. The specific letter forms, the spacing between characters, the precise way certain marks are combined, all reflect Swedish runic practice as it was understood and actually used in the 1800s, not as it was practiced in authentic medieval Scandinavia. A truly medieval inscription would show demonstrably different patterns based on linguistic analysis. Someone carving in 1898, even someone influenced by Scandinavian cultural heritage, would inevitably embed 19th and 20th century assumptions and stylistic choices into their work unconsciously. The navigational and logistical problem is perhaps the most serious obstacle to authenticity claims. In the 1360s, the St. Lawrence Seaway was not connected to the Great Lakes system in any navigable way, as Vikings would have needed for reasonable inland water transport. Numerous powerful waterfalls, dangerous rapids, and completely impassable sections blocked every potential river route between Newfoundland and the Great Lakes. Norse ships, while remarkably seaworthy for ocean navigation, required relatively calm and navigable water to traverse safely. The logistics of transporting a Viking expedition from Newfoundland to Minnesota would have been extraordinarily difficult, bordering on absolutely impossible with 14th century technology, navigation knowledge, and maritime resources. Overland portages between water systems would have been extraordinarily brutal and dangerous. The complete journey described on the stone would have consumed many months and faced countless life-threatening obstacles. While some theorists argue that ambitious and desperate Norse explorers might have attempted this, it remains highly speculative and requires accepting extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. There is also the puzzling matter of why no indigenous people recorded this alleged encounter in any documented way. Native Americans occupied Minnesota and the surrounding regions in the 1360s. If 22 Norse explorers had arrived, established a camp, and lost 10 men in violent conflict, surely some record of this significant encounter would exist in indigenous oral traditions or physical archaeological evidence that has survived to the present day. Archaeologists have found absolutely no verified Norse artifacts in Minnesota despite decades of searching. No indigenous records or oral traditions mention such an encounter. The stone stands entirely alone as evidence, completely unsupported by any other archaeological context or corroborating physical evidence. The social and cultural context surrounding the stone's discovery is equally suspicious and concerning to skeptics. Olof Öhman discovered the stone at a time of genuinely surging interest in Scandinavian heritage among Swedish and Scandinavian immigrants to America. The 1800s witnessed massive waves of Scandinavian immigration to Minnesota and surrounding regions. These immigrant communities actively and deliberately celebrated their cultural heritage and actively sought to establish cultural legitimacy and respect in their new homeland. They wanted their ancestors to have played a significant role in American history and discovery. The political and cultural climate of the time was actively primed for a discovery that would dramatically elevate Scandinavian status. A stone claiming that Vikings reached Minnesota 100 years before Columbus would have tremendous cultural and emotional appeal to this specific community. The historical timing and cultural context strongly suggest that genuine motivation for creating such an artifact existed among the Swedish immigrant population. The absence of a confession, sometimes cited as evidence supporting authenticity, actually cuts both ways in logical analysis. Yes, nobody has ever admitted to creating it as a hoax, but that does not prove it is authentic. The hoax might have been perpetrated by someone now long deceased. It might have been executed by a group of people and the secret kept collectively. It might have been created by someone who was deeply ashamed and chose permanent silence. The absence of a confession proves nothing conclusively about the stone's origin. Here we arrive at the fundamental heart of the contradiction. Both sides have presented genuinely compelling arguments. Both sides have evidence that appears to support their position. And yet, the evidence contradicts itself entirely on almost every major point. The weathering patterns seem to suggest medieval origin. The tool marks suggest 19th century creation. The linguistic style suggests 1800s fabrication. The geological composition suggests the stone is ancient. The context and circumstances suggest motivation for a hoax. The character of Öhman suggests integrity. The mysterious nature of his specific historical knowledge suggests literacy and education beyond his apparent formal station. The scientific and academic community has attempted to resolve this mystery through rigorous investigation and modern technology. Three-dimensional imaging projects have mapped the stone's surface with extraordinary precision and detail, providing new data about the depth and nature of the carvings. Advanced petrographic analysis has examined the stone's mineral composition in detail. Radiocarbon dating has been attempted, though the results have been inconclusive or disputed by experts. Metal analysis has examined any metal residue in the carvings. Linguistic experts have scrutinized every individual letter and mark. Archaeological surveys have searched extensively for supporting evidence. And yet, despite all this investigation and technological advancement, consensus remains remarkably elusive and contested. The current scholarly consensus in 2026 leans toward the interpretation that the Kensington Runestone is most likely a 19th century creation, probably carved by Öhman himself or by someone in his immediate social circle. The general academic and archaeological communities view it as a hoax, albeit a remarkably well-executed and sophisticated one. The geological evidence that the stone is not native to the area, combined with the linguistic and tool mark analysis, forms a persuasive case for 19th century origin. The complete archaeological absence of supporting evidence significantly strengthens this consensus position. However, significant numbers of scholars remain unconvinced by this mainstream consensus. They point to the weathering evidence, the apparent implausibility of Öhman's knowledge, and the absence of any fabrication confession as reasons for skepticism. They argue that the stone deserves serious consideration as potential evidence of authentic medieval Norse exploration. They note that new technologies continue to emerge that might provide definitive answers. They emphasize that we should remain skeptical of absolute claims given the genuine complexity of the evidence. What we know with absolute certainty is that Vikings did reach North America around 1000 AD, approximately 350 years before the date on the Kensington stone. The Lance Aux Meadows settlement is irrefutable archaeological evidence confirmed by multiple scientific dating methods. We know that medieval Vikings were skilled and experienced navigators who undertook remarkable long-distance voyages. We know that Norse explorers engaged in extensive trade networks across vast distances. We know that Norse explorers possessed both the motivation and theoretical capability for inland exploration. These established historical facts make medieval Norse exploration inland something theoretically plausible, even if ultimately unproven and undocumented. We also know that the Kensington Runestone contains genuine geological anomalies, tool mark characteristics, and linguistic patterns that are highly problematic for authenticity claims. We know that the historical context and cultural circumstances of its discovery created clear motivation for creating an elaborate hoax. We know that no independent corroborating evidence supports the stone's specific claims. We know that the navigational challenges of reaching Minnesota from Newfoundland in the 1360s were formidable and perhaps insurmountable. The stone has become deeply embedded in Minnesota's cultural identity and regional heritage. The region celebrates it as an important part of local history and cultural tradition. The Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, houses the artifact and attracts thousands of visitors interested in this enduring mystery. The very name of Minnesota's professional football team, the Minnesota Vikings, was directly influenced by the fame and cultural impact of the Kensington Runestone. It has transcended its role as a historical artifact to become an important cultural symbol representing regional pride and Scandinavian heritage. As of 2026, new research continues to emerge from technological advancement. Recent technological advances in three-dimensional scanning and detailed analysis provide unprecedented detail about the stone's surface characteristics. Satellite imagery has been employed to search systematically for additional Norse artifacts in the Minnesota region, so far without producing definitive results. Researchers continue to debate whether the extensive weathering patterns truly support medieval origin, or whether they might result from natural processes operating over shorter time frames than previously assumed by earlier researchers. The fundamental question remains unanswered and unresolved. Did a group of Vikings actually journey to Minnesota in 1362? Or did someone in 1898 create an elaborate hoax carved deliberately into stone? The evidence genuinely does contradict itself on virtually every major point of analysis. The stone could be either authentic or an exceptional forgery created by someone with remarkable skills. The Kensington Runestone exemplifies how genuine mystery can persist even under intense scientific scrutiny and investigation. It demonstrates that evidence is not always straightforward or unambiguous, that expert opinion can genuinely diverge even among qualified researchers, and that some questions do not readily yield to easy answers despite our best efforts. Perhaps future discoveries will settle the question decisively one way or another. Perhaps technology not yet developed will provide conclusive proof. Perhaps the stone will eventually reveal its deepest secrets. Or perhaps the Kensington Runestone will remain forever mysterious, a permanent reminder that history sometimes refuses to be neatly catalogued and conclusively explained. What we can say with genuine certainty is this: the stone's existence has forced us to reconsider what we knew about medieval exploration capabilities and the genuine achievements of Norse navigators. Whether authentic artifact or carefully crafted forgery, the Kensington Runestone has profoundly influenced how we understand America's past and Minnesota's place in history. And in that fundamental sense, regardless of its true origin and authenticity, it has already changed history.